Hi guys, welcome back to another deep dive into history's most fascinating and disturbing corners. Tonight, we are traveling back over 2,000 years to explore the underbelly of one of history's greatest civilizations. The Roman Empire, a place of marble columns, mighty legions, and incredible engineering marvels. But beneath all that grandeur lay a darker reality, a world where millions of people toiled in conditions that would make our worst modern jobs seem like luxury vacations. We're going to explore the most horrible, dangerous, and soul-crushing occupations that kept the Roman machine running. From the depths of underground mines where men disappeared forever, to the blood-soaked arenas where entertainment meant certain doom, to the toxic workshops where craftsmen slowly poisoned themselves for a few coins. These weren't just difficult jobs, they were sentences that often ended in suffering and early graves. So settle in as we journey through the empire's shadows, meeting the forgotten workers whose misery built Rome's glory. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. The Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents at its peak, encompassing nearly 60 million square kilometers and ruling over an estimated 60 to 70 million people. This massive civilization didn't sustain itself through magic or divine intervention. It was built on the backs of countless workers performing every imaginable task, from the glamorous to the utterly horrific. While senators debated in the forum and emperors lived in splendor, the vast majority of Romans worked jobs that ranged from merely unpleasant to absolutely nightmarish. To understand these horrible occupations, we need to first grasp the Roman social structure. At the top sat the emperor, followed by senators, equites or knights, then regular citizens, and finally non-citizens, including freedmen and slaves. Slaves made up perhaps 20 to 30% of the population in major cities, and they performed many of the most dangerous and degrading jobs. But citizenship didn't guarantee a comfortable life. Many free Romans worked in conditions that were barely better than slavery, driven by poverty and lack of alternatives. Roman society was intensely practical and results-oriented. If a job needed doing, someone would be found to do it, regardless of the personal cost to that individual. The empire's infrastructure, military might, and economic prosperity all depended on people willing or forced to perform tasks that modern occupational safety standards would never permit. There were no labor unions, no government safety inspections, no workers' compensation, and certainly no concept of work-life balance. The Roman workday typically began before dawn and continued until after sunset, with workers laboring 12 to 16 hours daily, depending on the season and demands of their occupation. Rest periods were minimal and often interrupted by emergencies or increased production quotas. Workers in most horrible occupations had no scheduled days off, working 7 days a week throughout the year, except for major religious festivals. Even during festivals, essential workers in mining, sanitation, and public safety had to continue their duties while others celebrated. The concept of retirement was completely foreign to workers in dangerous occupations. Most expected to work until they died or became too injured to continue, at which point they would usually be abandoned by their employers and left to survive on charity or starve. The few workers who managed to survive to old age in dangerous occupations were often so physically damaged that they couldn't enjoy whatever years remained to them. Economic pressures within the Roman system created a constant downward pressure on working conditions as employers competed to reduce costs by any means necessary. This competition frequently involved reducing already minimal safety precautions, increasing work hours, decreasing food rations for workers, and pushing production quotas beyond what human beings could safely achieve. Workers who complained about conditions were easily replaced from the constant supply of slaves, prisoners, and desperately poor free citizens. The geographic expansion of the Roman Empire created new opportunities for horrible occupations as the Romans encountered different climates, resources, and challenges that required specialized forms of dangerous work. Desert mining operations in North Africa exposed workers to extreme heat and dehydration that killed many within their first weeks on the job. Mountain mining in the Alps subjected workers to altitude sickness, extreme cold, and avalanche dangers that were completely foreign to workers from Mediterranean regions. Tropical regions of the empire introduced diseases that Roman workers had never encountered, creating occupational hazards that combined workplace dangers with deadly infections. Malaria, yellow fever, and other tropical diseases killed workers in large numbers. But the economic value of tropical resources meant that operations continued despite massive mortality rates among the workforce. Let's begin our journey into these horrible occupations by descending into the literal depths of Roman industry, the mines. Mining was perhaps the most universally dreaded occupation in the ancient world, and Roman mines were particularly notorious for their brutality. The empire's hunger for precious metals, building materials, and strategic resources drove a massive mining industry that consumed human lives like fuel. Gold mines were among the worst places a person could find themselves in the Roman world. The famous mines of Dacia, conquered by Emperor Trajan, produced enormous wealth for the empire, but at a staggering human cost. Miners worked in narrow tunnels, barely wide enough for a human body, following thin veins of gold ore deep into mountainsides. The air was thick with dust that slowly destroyed lungs, and cave-ins were constant threats that could bury workers alive without warning. The process of gold extraction involved crushing ore with heavy stone mills, then using mercury to separate the precious metal. Mercury poisoning was epidemic among gold miners, causing tremors, mental deterioration, and eventual death. The Romans called this condition the miner's sickness, but they had no understanding of its cause or cure. Workers simply accepted that handling the silvery liquid would eventually drive them mad and terminate their lives. Silver mines, particularly those in Spain, were equally horrific. The mines at Rio Tinto were worked continuously for centuries, creating a hellish landscape of poisoned earth and contaminated water. Miners descended hundreds of feet underground through crude rope and wooden contraptions that frequently failed, sending workers plummeting to their deaths. Once underground, they worked by the light of oil lamps that provided minimal illumination while consuming precious oxygen. The extraction process required miners to follow narrow silver veins through solid rock using only hand tools, hammers, chisels, and picks. Progress was measured in inches per day, and workers often spent their entire careers in a single tunnel that grew longer but never wider. The constant hammering in confined spaces caused permanent hearing damage, while the rock dust created lung diseases that made breathing increasingly difficult until workers essentially suffocated over a period of years. Lead mining presented its own unique horrors. Lead was essential for Roman plumbing, cosmetics, and food preparation, making it one of the most important industrial metals. But lead poisoning was even more insidious than mercury poisoning because its effects accumulated slowly over time. Early symptoms included fatigue and joint pain, which miners often attributed to the physical demands of their work. As poisoning progressed, workers experienced severe abdominal pain, cognitive decline, and eventually death. The irony was that Roman elites, who benefited from lead-lined water pipes and lead-sweetened wine, were also slowly poisoning themselves with the very metal their slaves and workers died to extract. Some historians believe that lead poisoning among the upper classes contributed to the decline of Roman leadership quality in later centuries, making it a metal that helped destroy both those who mined it and those who used it. The daily routine of lead miners was a nightmare of physical and chemical torture. Workers descended into mines before dawn, climbing down rope ladders that were often frayed and unreliable. The descent itself was dangerous, as ladders could break under the weight of multiple workers, sending them plummeting into the darkness below. Once underground, miners worked by the light of oil lamps that provided minimal illumination while consuming precious oxygen from the already limited air supply. The mining tunnels were barely wide enough for a single person, forcing workers to crawl or crouch for hours at a time while they chipped away at lead ore with hand tools. The confined space made it impossible to swing tools effectively, so progress was measured in inches per day rather than feet. Workers often developed severe back problems from working in cramped positions, and many suffered permanent spinal damage that left them unable to stand upright even when they weren't underground. Lead dust filled the air in these confined spaces, coating workers' lungs with toxic particles that accumulated over months and years of exposure. The dust also settled on workers' food and water, ensuring that they ingested lead through multiple pathways simultaneously. Many workers developed a metallic taste in their mouths that became permanent, and their gums often turned blue-black from lead deposits in their tissue. The extraction process required workers to carry heavy baskets of lead ore through narrow tunnels to the surface, a journey that could take hours depending on the depth of the mine. Workers had to navigate obstacles, including standing water, loose rocks, and areas where the ceiling was so low they had to crawl while carrying their loads. Many workers were injured when ore baskets shifted and crushed their hands or arms against tunnel walls. Surface processing of lead ore exposed additional workers to even higher concentrations of toxic dust and fumes. Smelting furnaces operated at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and workers had to stand close to these furnaces while feeding them ore and fuel. The heat was so intense that workers frequently collapsed from heat stroke, and those who fell too close to the furnaces often suffered severe burns or death. Lead smelting produced clouds of toxic vapor that contained pure lead particles, creating air pollution that affected entire communities around smelting operations. Workers who lived near smelters were exposed to lead poisoning even when they weren't working, as the contamination persisted in soil, water, and air for decades after smelting operations ended. Children born in these areas often showed signs of lead poisoning from birth, creating generations of people whose mental and physical development were stunted by industrial contamination. Iron mining was perhaps the most physically demanding of all mining occupations. Iron ore was heavy and difficult to extract, requiring workers to move massive quantities of rock and ore through narrow passages. The smelting process exposed workers to extreme heat and toxic fumes. Iron foundries operated continuously, with workers feeding furnaces that reached temperatures of over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Burns were common and often fatal, as medical treatment for severe burns was primitive at best. Coal mining, though less common than metal mining, was equally dangerous. Coal deposits were often found in areas prone to methane gas accumulation, leading to explosive fires that could kill entire work crews instantly. The Romans had no understanding of gas detection or ventilation systems, so miners simply hoped they wouldn't encounter a pocket of deadly gas. When explosions occurred, rescue was usually impossible due to collapsed tunnels and continuing fires underground. Stone quarrying, while technically not mining, shared many of the same dangers and horrible working conditions. The massive marble quarries of Carrara in northern Italy, which supplied stone for some of Rome's most magnificent buildings, were worked by slaves and condemned criminals who faced almost certain death. Workers used wooden wedges, water, and fire to split massive blocks of marble from quarry faces, a process that frequently resulted in unexpected rockfalls that could crush multiple workers simultaneously. The quarrying process began with workers climbing dangerous rock faces to identify suitable stone for extraction. These climbs were performed without any safety equipment, and falls were common and usually fatal. Workers carried heavy tools while climbing, making their grip on rock surfaces even more precarious. The quarry faces were often hundreds of feet high, and workers who fell from these heights had no chance of survival. Once suitable stone was identified, workers used a combination of fire and water to create thermal shock that would crack the rock along desired lines. This process required workers to build fires directly against rock faces, often while standing on narrow ledges or unstable scaffolding. The fires had to burn for hours to heat the rock sufficiently, and workers had to tend these fires continuously, exposing themselves to intense heat and toxic smoke from burning wood and other materials. After heating, workers poured cold water onto the hot rock, creating thermal shock that would crack the stone. This process was extremely dangerous because the thermal expansion and contraction could cause sudden, unpredictable fractures that might bring down tons of rock without warning. Workers had no way to predict when or where these fractures would occur, so they worked in constant danger of being crushed by falling stone. The actual extraction of stone blocks required dozens of workers coordinating their efforts to move pieces that weighed several tons each. Workers used wooden levers, ropes, and primitive pulleys to shift these massive blocks, but the equipment was often inadequate for the loads involved. When equipment failed, workers were frequently crushed under shifting stone blocks or injured by snapping ropes and breaking wooden tools. Moving quarried blocks from extraction sites to transportation points required workers to build temporary roads and ramps using only hand tools and human power. These construction projects were almost as dangerous as the quarrying itself, as workers had to move massive blocks down steep mountainsides using primitive equipment that frequently failed. Runaway stone blocks killed numerous workers when they broke free from their restraints and rolled down mountainsides at tremendous speed. The loading of stone blocks onto carts and ships presented additional deadly challenges. Workers had to position themselves under multi-ton blocks while maneuvering them onto transportation equipment using wooden levers and rope systems. The precise coordination required for these operations meant that a single worker's mistake could kill multiple team members instantly. Loading accidents were so common that quarries maintained permanent crews for removing crushed workers from under stone blocks. Transportation of stone blocks was equally hazardous for the workers involved. Ox-drawn carts carrying stone frequently overturned on rough roads, crushing the drivers and any workers walking alongside the carts. River transportation was somewhat safer, but still dangerous, as loaded boats could sink suddenly if they encountered rough water or if their stone cargo shifted during transport. The finishing work required to prepare quarried stone for construction created additional categories of dangerous occupations. Stone carvers worked with hammers and chisels for hours at a time, creating clouds of stone dust that caused severe respiratory problems. The constant hammering damaged workers' hearing and caused repetitive stress injuries in their arms and shoulders. Many stone carvers developed a characteristic tremor in their hands from the constant vibration of their tools. Polishing finished stone required workers to use abrasive materials, including sand, pumice, and sometimes toxic compounds that gave stone its final appearance. This work was performed in confined spaces where dust concentrations were extremely high, and workers absorbed abrasive particles through their lungs and skin. The polishing compounds sometimes contained lead or other toxic metals that caused gradual poisoning in addition to the respiratory damage from dust inhalation. The transportation of quarried stone was almost as dangerous as the extraction process. Massive blocks weighing several tons had to be moved using only human power, ropes, and primitive wooden machinery. Workers were regularly crushed under shifting loads or killed when ropes failed and blocks rolled down mountainsides. The Roman passion for monumental architecture literally required human sacrifice on an industrial scale. The engineering required to move massive stone blocks created some of the most dangerous occupations in the Roman world. Workers called tracinari specialized in stone transportation, using a combination of wooden rollers, rope systems, and inclined planes to move blocks that weighed as much as small buildings. These workers had to coordinate complex operations involving dozens of people pulling ropes and positioning equipment, and any miscommunication could result in multiple deaths instantly. The rope systems used for stone transportation were made from plant fibers that deteriorated rapidly under the enormous loads they were required to bear. Workers never knew when a rope might snap, sending a multi-ton block crashing down on anyone in its path. The constant stress of working with equipment that could fail without warning created severe psychological pressure in addition to the physical dangers of the work. Wooden machinery used for stone transportation included elaborate pulley systems and lever arrangements that multiplied human force, but also multiplied the potential for catastrophic failure. These machines were built on site using local materials and were rarely tested before being loaded with stone blocks. When they failed, the results were usually devastating for any workers in the immediate area. The seasonal nature of quarrying work created additional hardships for workers, as stone extraction was only possible during certain months when weather conditions allowed access to quarry sites. During working seasons, quarry workers faced intense pressure to extract as much stone as possible before winter weather made operations impossible. This pressure led to increased accident rates as safety precautions were ignored in favor of meeting production quotas. Winter unemployment forced quarry workers to seek other forms of dangerous work during off-seasons, often in occupations where their specialized skills were not applicable. Many quarry workers took jobs in construction, mining, or other industries during winter months, exposing themselves to different but equally serious occupational hazards throughout the year. The remote locations of many quarries meant that injured workers had little access to medical care, and many died from injuries that might have been treatable in urban areas. Quarry sites were often located in mountainous regions far from major cities, and transportation of injured workers to medical facilities was often impossible due to rough terrain and primitive transportation methods. The psychological impact of quarry work on workers was severe, as they witnessed frequent deaths and serious injuries among their colleagues, while knowing that they faced the same risks daily. The stress of working with equipment that could fail catastrophically at any moment, combined with the constant presence of death and injury, created mental health problems that were never recognized or treated by Roman society. Quarry communities developed their own cultures around death and injury, with workers often developing fatalistic attitudes that helped them cope with the constant presence of danger. These communities had unusually high rates of alcoholism and other forms of self-medication as workers tried to manage the psychological stress of their occupations. The economic pressure on quarry operations meant that safety equipment, even when it existed, was rarely provided to workers because it was considered an unnecessary expense. Workers were expected to provide their own tools and protective equipment, but most were too poor to afford anything beyond the most basic implements. This lack of investment in worker safety was seen as normal business practice rather than negligence. Moving from the underground horrors of mining, we encounter another category of horrible Roman occupations, those involving human waste and disposal of the dead. Roman cities, with their large populations concentrated in relatively small areas, generated enormous quantities of waste that had to be managed by someone. These sanitation jobs were among the most despised and dangerous in Roman society. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer system, required constant maintenance by workers who descended into the underground tunnels to clear blockages and repair damage. Sewer workers, known as cloacari, worked in spaces filled with toxic gases, human waste, and decomposing organic matter. The methane and hydrogen sulfide gases produced by waste decomposition could kill workers instantly, while prolonged exposure caused chronic illness and early death. These underground workers faced additional dangers from flooding during heavy rains, when the sewers could fill rapidly with rushing water that swept workers away to drown in filth. The Roman writers rarely mentioned sewer workers in their histories, but archaeological evidence suggests they had extremely short life expectancies and were drawn primarily from the slave population and condemned criminals. The construction and maintenance of Rome's sewer system created a hierarchy of horrible occupations, each with its own specific dangers and health hazards. The most dangerous work involved digging new sewer tunnels through solid rock and unstable soil. These excavation workers, called fossores, worked in conditions that combined the dangers of mining with the additional hazards of working in areas that would eventually carry human waste. Tunnel excavation required workers to dig by hand through rock and earth using only primitive tools. The work was performed in spaces barely large enough for human bodies, and cave-ins were a constant threat. Unlike mining operations, sewer construction couldn't use supporting timbers extensively because the finished tunnels needed to allow water flow. So workers excavated in largely unsupported passages that could collapse without warning. The gradient calculations required for proper sewer function meant that workers had to dig tunnels following precise elevation changes over long distances. This engineering requirement forced excavation crews to work in tunnels that followed specific paths regardless of ground conditions, often requiring them to dig through particularly unstable soil or rock formations that a mining operation would have avoided. Waterproofing sewer tunnels required workers to apply lime-based mortars and other chemical treatments in confined underground spaces filled with toxic fumes. The lime caused severe chemical burns on contact with skin, and workers often suffered permanent damage to their eyes and respiratory systems from working with these materials in poorly ventilated spaces. The chemical reactions involved in waterproofing also produced toxic gases that could overcome workers instantly. Sewer junction construction was particularly dangerous because it required workers to excavate large chambers where multiple tunnels met. These chambers had to be supported during construction using wooden frameworks that were often inadequate for the loads they needed to bear. When these supports failed, they usually killed everyone working in the chamber at the time. The installation of sewer covers and access points required workers to coordinate underground and surface operations while managing heavy stone covers that weighed hundreds of pounds each. Surface workers had to position these covers precisely over underground openings, while underground workers guided them into place. Miscommunication between surface and underground crews frequently resulted in workers being crushed under falling stone covers. Sewer cleaning operations required workers to enter functioning sewers to remove blockages and accumulated debris. This work exposed them not only to toxic gases and human waste, but also to the risk of being swept away by sudden water flows. Rome's sewers were designed to handle storm runoff as well as human waste, so water levels could rise rapidly during heavy rains, trapping workers in underground passages. The tools used for sewer cleaning were primitive and often broke during use, leaving workers stranded in toxic environments while they tried to repair their equipment or signal for help. Sewer workers carried oil lamps for illumination, but these flames could ignite methane gases in the tunnels, causing explosions that killed entire work crews instantly. Dead animal removal from sewers was a specialized occupation that combined the hazards of sewer work with the additional dangers of handling decomposing carcasses in confined spaces. Animals that died in the city often washed into the sewer system, where their decomposing bodies created blockages and increased the concentration of toxic gases. Workers who removed these carcasses were exposed to diseases carried by the dead animals as well as the normal hazards of sewer work. The seasonal nature of sewer maintenance meant that workers faced peak dangers during spring months, when winter accumulations of waste and debris had to be cleared before the summer heat made conditions even worse. This seasonal pressure led to increased accident rates as workers rushed to complete cleaning operations before hot weather made the work completely unbearable. Night soil collectors, who gathered human waste from private homes and public latrines, faced different but equally severe health hazards. They worked primarily at night, collecting waste in large containers that they carried through city streets to disposal areas outside the urban core. The work exposed them to every disease and parasite that affected the Roman population, and their mortality rates were among the highest of any occupation. The disposal of dead animals presented another category of horrible work. Roman cities contained thousands of horses, oxen, donkeys, and other working animals, as well as pets and livestock kept within urban areas. When these animals died, their carcasses had to be removed and disposed of quickly to prevent disease outbreaks. Dead animal collectors worked without any protective equipment, handling decomposing carcasses with their bare hands and transporting them in carts through populated areas. Human corpse handling was considered even more degrading than animal disposal. While wealthy Romans could afford elaborate funeral rites and professional undertakers, the poor often had their bodies disposed of by workers called palinctors, who collected unclaimed corpses and buried them in mass graves outside city walls. These workers handled bodies in various states of decomposition, often working in conditions that spread infectious diseases throughout the worker population. The daily routine of corpse handlers began before dawn as they made rounds through the city, collecting bodies that had been reported by neighbors or discovered by city officials. Many of these corpses had been dead for several days before discovery, particularly during summer months when decomposition accelerated rapidly. Workers had to handle these bodies with their bare hands, as gloves were unknown and would have been considered an unnecessary expense even if they had existed. Transportation of corpses through city streets required workers to load bodies onto carts without any protective equipment or procedures to prevent disease transmission. Multiple corpses were often loaded together, and the mixing of bodily fluids from different deceased individuals created opportunities for disease spread that affected both the workers and any bystanders who came into contact with the transport carts. The mass burial sites outside Roman cities were essentially open pits where corpses were deposited with minimal ceremony or organization. Workers had to climb into these pits to arrange bodies in ways that maximized space utilization, exposing them to concentrative disease environments where multiple infectious agents were present simultaneously. The decomposition gases from mass graves could overcome workers instantly, and many corpse handlers died from inhaling toxic gases while working in burial pits. Disease transmission among corpse handlers was inevitable given their working conditions, and mortality rates among these workers were among the highest of any occupation in Roman society. Plague, cholera, and other infectious diseases spread rapidly among workers who handled multiple infected corpses daily. The social isolation of corpse handlers meant that when they became ill, they often had no access to medical care and frequently died alone. Seasonal variations in corpse handling work created periods of extreme danger, alternating with periods of relative safety. Summer months brought increased mortality from heat-related deaths and faster decomposition rates, creating more dangerous working conditions for corpse handlers. Winter deaths from cold and disease created different challenges, as frozen corpses were difficult to handle and transport using primitive equipment. The ritual purification requirements associated with corpse handling in Roman religion created additional burdens for workers in this occupation. While they were required to perform certain cleansing rituals after handling bodies, these workers were generally too poor to afford the materials needed for proper purification ceremonies. This religious contamination added social stigma to the physical dangers of corpse handling. Body identification and record-keeping for mass burials required workers to examine corpses for identifying characteristics and personal effects before burial. This close examination exposed workers to concentrated disease environments and often revealed evidence of violent deaths that created additional psychological trauma for corpse handlers. The disposal of executed criminals created a specialized subcategory of corpse handling that involved additional dangers from both the authorities and the families of the deceased. Workers who handled the bodies of executed criminals sometimes faced retaliation from criminal organizations or families who blamed them for participating in the execution process. Personal effects removal from corpses was technically part of corpse handling work, but it often exposed workers to accusations of theft if valuable items went missing during the disposal process. This created legal dangers in addition to the health hazards of corpse handling, as workers could be executed for theft even when they were innocent of any wrongdoing. The psychological impact of daily exposure to death and decomposition created mental health problems among corpse handlers that were never recognized or treated by Roman society. Many workers in this occupation developed what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety disorders from their constant exposure to death and social isolation. The amphitheater brought its own category of horrible jobs, though these were different from mining or sanitation work. While gladiators often get the most attention when we discuss Roman entertainment, they were just the visible tip of an enormous industry built on human misery and death. Behind every gladiatorial game were dozens of support workers whose jobs were equally dangerous and far less glamorous. Beast handlers, known as bestiarii, worked with the wild animals that were imported from across the empire for arena entertainment. These workers had to capture, transport, house, and train animals that ranged from lions and tigers to elephants and rhinoceroses. The capture process alone was incredibly dangerous, requiring workers to track and trap large predators in their natural habitats using primitive equipment. Transportation of wild animals across the Mediterranean presented additional challenges. Animals were kept in cramped wooden cages on ships for voyages that could last weeks or months. Handlers had to feed the animals, clean their cages, and treat injuries, all while working in confined spaces with creatures that could terminate them instantly. Ship records from the period show that animal handlers had some of the highest casualty rates of any maritime occupation. Once animals reached Rome, they had to be housed in underground chambers beneath the amphitheaters until their performance dates. These subterranean areas, called hypogeum, were dark, poorly ventilated spaces filled with the sounds and smells of hundreds of wild animals. Workers descended into this environment daily to feed animals, clean cages, and prepare them for arena appearances. Maulings were common, and workers often died from infected wounds when medical treatment was inadequate. The hypogeum represented one of the most complex and dangerous working environments in the Roman world, combining the challenges of managing large predators with the hazards of working in confined underground spaces. The underground chambers were connected by a maze of tunnels and passages that workers had to navigate in near total darkness while carrying food, water, and cleaning supplies to animals that could kill them instantly. Feeding dangerous animals required workers to approach cages containing lions, tigers, bears, and other predators that were often stressed and aggressive from captivity. The feeding process involved opening cage doors or passing food through bars while maintaining enough distance to avoid being grabbed by claws or teeth. Many workers were pulled against cage bars and mauled by animals that were able to reach through the openings. Cage cleaning in the hypogeum required workers to enter enclosures that had recently housed large predators, exposing them to territorial scent marking and aggressive behavior from animals that viewed the workers as invaders. Even when animals were temporarily relocated, their cages retained scent markers that could trigger aggressive responses when the animals returned. Water provision for animals in the underground chambers required workers to carry heavy containers through narrow passages and pour water into drinking vessels while animals were present in their cages. This work required workers to approach closely enough to predators to be within striking distance, and many water carriers were killed by animals that attacked through cage bars. The ventilation systems in the hypogeum were inadequate for the number of animals housed there, creating an atmosphere thick with dust, animal hair, and concentrated animal scents that caused respiratory problems among workers. The poor air quality also meant that diseases spread rapidly between animals and from animals to workers, creating health hazards that extended beyond the immediate danger of animal attacks. Medical care for injured animals fell to workers who had no veterinary training but were required to treat wounds, illnesses, and behavioral problems in creatures that remained dangerous even when sick or injured. Workers treating injured predators faced the dual challenges of providing medical care while avoiding being killed by their patients. Animal training for arena performances required workers to teach complex behaviors to creatures that retained their wild instincts and viewed humans as either prey or threats. Training sessions often resulted in serious injuries when animals refused to perform required behaviors or when their predatory instincts overcame their training. The mechanical systems used to lift animals from the hypogeum to the arena floor were complex arrangements of pulleys, counterweights, and trapdoors that required precise coordination between multiple workers. These systems frequently malfunctioned, trapping animals between floors or crushing workers who were operating the lifting machinery. Escape prevention required workers to inspect and maintain cage locks, bars, and structural elements that contained some of the most dangerous animals in the world. This maintenance work required close approach to cages containing aggressive predators, and workers performing repairs were frequent targets for animal attacks through cage openings. The removal of dead animals from the hypogeum required workers to enter cages containing decomposing carcasses, while other live animals were present nearby. The scent of death often triggered aggressive behavior in surviving animals, making corpse removal an extremely dangerous operation that frequently resulted in worker casualties. Night shifts in the hypogeum were particularly dangerous because the reduced staffing levels meant that workers often worked alone in areas containing hundreds of dangerous animals. If a worker was injured during night hours, help might not arrive until the following day, and many night shift workers died from injuries that might have been survivable with prompt medical attention. The psychological stress of working daily with animals that could kill without warning created mental health problems among hypogeum workers that affected their judgment and reaction times. Workers who developed fear responses or panic disorders were more likely to make mistakes that resulted in fatal encounters with animals. Seasonal variations in animal behavior created periods when hypogeum work was even more dangerous than usual. Breeding seasons brought increased aggression among animals, while seasonal diseases spread rapidly through animal populations and jumped to human workers. Temperature changes also affected animal behavior in ways that workers often didn't understand until they became victims of attacks. The arena itself required extensive support staff beyond the gladiators and animal handlers. Sand spreaders had to work between events to cover bloodstains and remove body parts from the arena floor. This job required workers to enter the arena while it was still filled with the scent of blood and death, potentially triggering aggressive behavior from any remaining animals or wounded fighters. Corpse draggers, called libitinari after Libitina, the goddess of death, removed dead bodies from the arena during breaks in the entertainment. These workers used hooks to drag corpses across the sand, often while spectators threw objects and shouted insults at them. The work was not only physically demanding, but also psychologically traumatic, as workers had to handle mutilated human remains while being jeered by crowds. Body disposal after gladiatorial games created additional horrible jobs. Some corpses went to medical schools for anatomical study, but most were simply dumped in mass graves outside the city. Workers who transported and buried these bodies worked without protection against disease, handling corpses that had often been severely mutilated by animals or weapons. The Roman military, while often romanticized in modern popular culture, generated its own categories of horrible occupations. While being a legionnaire was dangerous, there were support roles within the military that were far worse than frontline combat. Camp followers, engineers, and specialists often faced greater risks and received less recognition than ordinary soldiers. Military engineers, called munitors, were responsible for siege warfare construction and fortification building. During sieges, these workers had to construct battering rams, siege towers, and other equipment while under constant attack from defenders. They worked without armor or shields, making them easy targets for enemy arrows and spears. The casualty rates among military engineers during major sieges often exceeded those of the combat troops they supported. Sap miners, who dug tunnels under enemy fortifications, faced some of the most dangerous conditions in ancient warfare. These workers tunneled through earth and rock, often working in spaces so narrow they couldn't turn around, while enemy defenders tried to detect and counter their efforts. Countermining by defenders could result in underground battles fought in complete darkness with hand tools. When tunnels collapsed, miners were usually buried alive with no possibility of rescue. Military road building was another horrible occupation that combined back-breaking physical labor with constant danger. Roman roads were built to incredibly high standards, requiring workers to level terrain, lay foundations, and place stones with precise measurements. Road builders worked in hostile territory where they were vulnerable to attack by local populations who opposed Roman expansion. The work continued regardless of weather conditions, and workers who couldn't maintain the pace were often abandoned to die. The construction of Roman roads required extensive preliminary surveying and planning that exposed advance teams to particular dangers. Survey crews had to travel ahead of the main construction force to map routes through hostile territory, often working in small groups that were vulnerable to attack by local tribes or bandits. These preliminary teams faced the combined dangers of military action and wilderness survival while carrying valuable surveying equipment that made them attractive targets for robbery. Foundation excavation for Roman roads required workers to dig trenches several feet deep across many miles of terrain, often through rocky soil that damaged tools and injured workers. The excavation work had to be completed quickly to maintain construction schedules, so workers were pushed to dig regardless of ground conditions, weather, or their physical condition. Many road builders developed severe back problems from the constant digging motion, and herniated discs were common injuries that left workers permanently disabled. Stone cutting and preparation for road construction required workers to quarry and shape millions of individual stones to precise specifications. This work combined the dangers of quarrying with the added pressure of meeting construction deadlines, leading to increased accident rates as workers took risks to speed production. Road construction stones had to meet exact size and shape requirements. So workers often had to perform precision cutting work under time pressure that increased the likelihood of tool accidents. The transportation of construction materials to road building sites required massive logistical operations involving thousands of workers moving stone, gravel, sand, and other materials across long distances using only human and animal power. These supply operations were vulnerable to weather delays, equipment failures, and enemy attacks that could cut off road construction teams from essential materials. Drainage system construction for Roman roads required workers to dig side channels and install underground drainage that would prevent water damage to the finished roadway. This drainage work was performed simultaneously with road construction, creating work sites where multiple dangerous operations were occurring in close proximity. Workers were frequently injured by construction equipment from other teams, or crushed under materials being moved by different work crews. Bridge construction, as part of road building projects, created some of the most dangerous working conditions in Roman construction. Road builders had to construct bridges over rivers, gorges, and other obstacles using primitive equipment while working at dangerous heights over water or steep drops. Bridge construction required precise coordination between multiple work teams, and communication failures often resulted in multiple casualties when equipment failed or structures collapsed. Road paving work required workers to fit individual stones together with mathematical precision while working in long lines across miles of roadway. Paving crews worked bent over for hours at a time, placing stones according to precise patterns that required constant attention to detail. The repetitive motion of stone placement caused severe joint problems and back injuries, while the precision requirements meant that workers couldn't rest or vary their working positions to relieve physical stress. Compaction of finished road surfaces required workers to operate heavy stone rollers and tamping equipment that could crush anyone who fell in front of the machinery. Road compaction was performed by teams of workers pulling massive stone rollers across finished pavement, and workers who tripped or lost their footing were frequently crushed under equipment that couldn't be stopped quickly enough to avoid accidents. Quality control for Roman road construction was maintained through harsh punishment of workers whose work failed to meet specifications. Workers who placed stones incorrectly or failed to maintain proper grades faced physical punishment or execution, creating work environments where fear of punishment often led to fatal accidents, as workers took desperate risks to avoid being discovered making mistakes. The military nature of road construction meant that workers were subject to military discipline and were expected to continue working under conditions that would have stopped civilian construction projects. Road builders worked through storms, extreme heat, and other weather conditions that made construction work particularly dangerous, and workers who refused to continue working faced punishment for military insubordination. Winter road construction in northern provinces exposed workers to extreme cold and weather conditions that caused frostbite, hypothermia, and death from exposure. Workers often had inadequate clothing and shelter for winter conditions, and the remote locations of many construction projects meant that medical care was unavailable when workers developed cold-related injuries. Military supply trains required workers called mules who carried equipment and supplies across enormous distances on foot. These workers carried loads of 60 to 80 pounds across mountains, deserts, and hostile territory. They had no combat training and minimal protection, making them easy targets for raiders and bandits. Supply train workers often died from exhaustion, exposure, or attack before reaching their destinations. Medical corpsmen in the Roman army, called medici, faced unique challenges that combined medical knowledge with battlefield dangers. These workers had to treat wounded soldiers under combat conditions, often working without adequate supplies or equipment. They were prime targets for enemy forces because eliminating medical personnel reduced army effectiveness. Medical workers also faced constant exposure to infectious diseases and battle injuries that often proved fatal despite their medical knowledge. Roman urban occupations included numerous horrible jobs that kept cities functioning but destroyed the health and lives of workers who performed them. The concentration of people in urban areas created demand for services that were inherently dangerous or degrading, and these jobs were typically filled by slaves, freedmen, and the desperate poor. Public bath maintenance workers, called balneari, worked in environments filled with extreme heat, humidity, and toxic fumes. Roman baths operated furnaces that heated water and air for the bathing chambers, requiring workers to tend fires that reached temperatures of over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The furnaces burned wood, charcoal, and sometimes coal, producing carbon monoxide and other toxic gases that accumulated in underground heating chambers. Bath workers also maintained the complex plumbing systems that supplied hot and cold water throughout the bath complexes. This work required entering confined spaces filled with steam and hot water pipes that could cause severe burns. Workers regularly suffered from heat exhaustion and dehydration, and many developed chronic respiratory problems from inhaling steam and smoke. The water supply systems of Roman cities required constant maintenance by workers who faced numerous hazards. Aqueduct maintenance workers had to clean and repair the channels that carried water from distant sources into urban areas. This work often required working at dangerous heights on narrow walkways with minimal safety equipment. Workers who fell from aqueducts usually died instantly, and their bodies were often never recovered. Lead pipe maintenance exposed workers to constant lead poisoning while requiring them to work in cramped underground spaces. Pipe workers used lead solder and lead-based materials daily, absorbing the toxic metal through their skin and lungs. The gradual onset of lead poisoning symptoms meant that workers often didn't realize they were being poisoned until the damage was irreversible. Water wheel operators worked in buildings housing the massive wheels that lifted water from rivers and wells into urban distribution systems. These facilities were incredibly dangerous, with large rotating machinery that could crush workers instantly if they got too close to moving parts. The wheels operated continuously, requiring workers to perform maintenance and repairs on moving machinery without any safety procedures. Roman manufacturing created numerous occupations that exposed workers to toxic materials and dangerous processes. The empire's demand for luxury goods, weapons, and everyday items drove industries that prioritized production over worker safety, resulting in occupations that routinely killed or maimed those who performed them. Glassmaking was one of the most hazardous manufacturing occupations in the Roman world. Glass furnaces operated at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and workers had to manipulate molten glass using long iron rods while standing close to the furnace openings. Burns were inevitable and often fatal, as the Romans had no effective treatment for severe thermal injuries. The glass-making process also exposed workers to toxic fumes from the raw materials, which included lead oxide, antimony, and other dangerous compounds. Prolonged exposure to these fumes caused respiratory diseases and heavy metal poisoning. Glass workers often developed a characteristic tremor and cognitive decline that Romans called the glassmaker's curse. Pottery production, while seemingly less dangerous than glassmaking, exposed workers to different but equally serious health hazards. Potter's wheels were turned by foot power, requiring workers to maintain awkward positions for hours at a time, leading to severe joint problems and spinal injuries. The clay dust created during pottery production caused a lung disease similar to modern silicosis, gradually reducing workers' ability to breathe until they suffocated. Lead glazes used on Roman pottery created additional poisoning hazards. Workers who applied glazes absorbed lead through their skin and lungs, developing the same symptoms as lead miners, but often taking longer to realize the cause of their illness. Many pottery workers developed what we now know as lead-induced gout, experiencing severe joint pain that made their work increasingly difficult. Metalworking occupations exposed workers to extreme heat, toxic fumes, and heavy metals. Bronze workers melted copper and tin in furnaces that reached temperatures of nearly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, creating toxic copper fumes that caused respiratory problems and neurological damage. The casting process required workers to pour molten metal into molds, a procedure that frequently resulted in severe burns when metal splashed or molds cracked. Ironworking was even more dangerous than bronze production. Iron furnaces operated at higher temperatures and required constant attention to maintain proper conditions. Iron workers breathed fumes containing iron oxide particles that accumulated in their lungs, causing a disease that gradually reduced their breathing capacity. The hammering required to shape iron caused hearing loss and joint injuries, while the extreme heat led to dehydration and heat stroke. Tanning and leatherworking created some of the most unpleasant working conditions in the Roman world. The tanning process used animal urine, dung, and tree bark to process animal hides into leather, creating an overwhelming stench that could be detected from miles away. Tanneries were typically located outside city limits due to the smell and water pollution they created. Tanners worked with their hands constantly immersed in solutions containing animal waste and toxic chemicals. The constant moisture and chemical exposure caused severe skin problems, including permanent scarring and chronic infections. The ammonia from urine caused respiratory irritation and eye damage, while the bacteria from animal waste led to frequent intestinal illnesses. The leather dyeing process added additional hazards, as dyes were often made from toxic substances, including heavy metals and poisonous plants. Red dye frequently contained mercury compounds, while black dyes used iron-based chemicals that could cause organ damage. Leather workers absorbed these toxins through their skin during the dyeing process, leading to gradual poisoning over the course of their careers. Fuller's work, which involved cleaning and processing woolen cloth, exposed workers to a unique combination of chemical and biological hazards. The fulling process used human urine as a cleaning agent, requiring workers to collect, store, and work with large quantities of urine daily. Fresh urine was preferred for its ammonia content, so fullers often worked with waste that was still warm and carried all the diseases present in the donor population. Fullers also used a variety of plant and mineral-based chemicals to clean and whiten cloth. Sulfur compounds were commonly used as bleaching agents, producing toxic fumes that caused respiratory problems and skin irritation. Workers in fulleries developed characteristic coughs and skin conditions that marked their occupation as clearly as any brand. The trampling process, where workers literally walked on cloth in vats of cleaning solution, required them to work barefoot in mixtures of urine and chemicals for hours at a time. This constant exposure caused severe foot problems, including chemical burns and chronic infections. Fullers often developed distinctive gait problems from the repetitive trampling motion and the chemical damage to their feet. Agricultural work, while essential for feeding the empire, included several occupations that were particularly horrible even by Roman standards. Large agricultural estates, called latifundia, operated like industrial farms, using slave labor and dangerous techniques that prioritized production over human welfare. Sulfur mining for agricultural purposes was one of the most toxic occupations in the Roman world. Sulfur was used as a preservative and pesticide, but mining it exposed workers to pure sulfur dioxide gas that could be fatal in high concentrations. Sulfur miners worked in volcanic areas where gas emissions were unpredictable and often lethal. The sulfur extraction process required workers to heat sulfur-bearing rocks in furnaces, creating enormous clouds of toxic gas. Workers had no protection against these fumes and frequently died from acute poisoning during the extraction process. Those who survived repeated exposure developed chronic respiratory problems that made breathing increasingly difficult over time. Threshing and winnowing grain created occupational hazards that were less obvious but equally serious. Workers who separated grain from chaff were constantly surrounded by clouds of grain dust and plant particles that caused severe respiratory problems. Threshers developed what we now call farmer's lung, a condition that gradually destroyed their breathing capacity. The repetitive motions required for grain processing caused severe joint problems, particularly in the shoulders and arms. Workers who used flails to thresh grain often developed characteristic deformities in their dominant arm from the constant overhead swinging motion. These injuries made other types of work impossible, trapping workers in agricultural labor even as their bodies broke down. Olive processing created its own category of horrible working conditions. The pressing required to extract olive oil involved enormous stone wheels that could crush workers who got too close to the machinery. Oil presses operated with tremendous pressure, and mechanical failures could result in explosions of stone and metal that killed multiple workers simultaneously. Olive workers also faced chemical hazards from the processing treatments used to prepare different grades of oil. Some processes used lye solutions that could cause severe chemical burns, while others involved fermentation that produced toxic alcohols. Workers who processed olives often developed characteristic hand and forearm injuries from the repetitive pressing motions and chemical exposure. Wine production involved several horrible occupations that combined physical dangers with toxic exposure. Grape harvesting itself was relatively safe, but the fermentation and storage processes created serious hazards for workers. Wine cave workers had to enter confined spaces where carbon dioxide from fermentation could displace oxygen, causing workers to lose consciousness and suffocate. The winemaking process also required workers to handle large ceramic vessels called amphorae that could weigh several hundred pounds when filled. Moving these containers required multiple workers and primitive lifting equipment that frequently failed, crushing workers under massive ceramic and liquid loads. Broken amphorae created sharp ceramic fragments that caused severe cuts and infections. Wine preservation used lead compounds that slowly poisoned workers who handled treated wine regularly. Many wine workers developed chronic lead poisoning without understanding the cause, experiencing gradual cognitive decline and physical deterioration over the course of their careers. Roman transportation created numerous horrible occupations that combined physical danger with extreme working conditions. The empire's vast size required the movement of people and goods across enormous distances, creating demand for workers willing to face the hazards of ancient transportation. Galley slaves represented perhaps the most horrible transportation occupation in the ancient world. These workers were chained to rowing benches on warships and merchant vessels, required to row for hours at a time in cramped conditions below deck. The rowing motion in confined spaces caused severe back and shoulder injuries, while the chained position made it impossible to escape when ships were damaged in storms or combat. Galley slaves worked in spaces filled with the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and bilge water. Diseases spread rapidly in these conditions, and sick slaves were often thrown overboard to prevent epidemics. The mortality rate among galley slaves was extremely high, with most surviving less than 2 years under these conditions. The rowing rhythm was maintained by overseers, who used whips to ensure maximum speed during combat or emergency situations. Slaves who couldn't maintain the pace were beaten severely, and those who collapsed were often beaten to death to maintain discipline among the remaining rowers. Merchant ship workers faced different but equally serious hazards. Loading and unloading cargo required moving extremely heavy items using only human power and primitive mechanical aids. Cargo handlers were regularly crushed under shifting loads or injured when lifting equipment failed. Docks were dangerous places where workers fell into water while handling cargo, often drowning because few people knew how to swim. Ship maintenance required workers to perform dangerous tasks at sea and in port. Hull repairs below the waterline required workers to work underwater while holding their breath, a task that frequently resulted in drowning. Rigging maintenance required climbing tall masts in all weather conditions, and falls from ship rigging were usually fatal. The caulking process used to seal ship hulls exposed workers to toxic substances, including pitch, tar, and lead compounds. Caulkers worked in confined spaces below deck, breathing fumes from these materials while working in awkward positions. Many caulkers developed chronic respiratory problems and lead poisoning from their daily exposure to these substances. Land transportation created its own category of horrible occupations. Road maintenance workers had to repair surfaces damaged by heavy traffic and weather while working on active roadways where they were vulnerable to injury from passing carts and animals. Road workers also had to quarry and transport stone for repairs, combining the hazards of stone cutting with heavy manual labor. Bridge construction and maintenance exposed workers to the danger of drowning as well as the usual hazards of stone construction. Roman bridges were built using sophisticated engineering techniques, but the construction process required workers to work at dangerous heights over rivers and gorges. Falls were usually fatal, and workers who fell into water often drowned due to the weight of their tools and clothing. Cart drivers and muleteers faced constant dangers from bandits, wild animals, and accidents. The Roman road system was extensive, but not always safe, particularly in frontier regions where local populations were hostile to Roman presence. Transport workers were prime targets for robbers because they carried valuable goods but had minimal protection. Animal handling for transportation created additional hazards. Ox drivers worked with massive animals that could easily kill humans with a kick or by trampling. Loading carts required positioning workers dangerously close to these animals, and many transport workers were injured or killed by the animals they worked with daily. Pack animal maintenance required workers to treat injuries and illnesses in animals that were often stressed and unpredictable. Veterinary knowledge was limited, and workers often had to handle sick animals that might spread diseases to humans. Anthrax was particularly common among livestock, and workers who handled infected animals often contracted the disease and died. Roman construction created some of the most dangerous occupations in the ancient world, as the empire's passion for monumental architecture required workers to perform incredibly hazardous tasks with primitive equipment. The massive building projects that defined Roman civilization were built with human lives as much as stone and mortar. High construction work on temples, amphitheaters, and other monumental buildings required workers to work at extreme heights using only rope and wooden scaffolding. The scaffolding was often inadequate for the loads it had to bear, and collapses were common events that killed multiple workers simultaneously. Workers had no safety equipment and relied entirely on their own strength and balance to avoid falling. The lifting of massive stone blocks required human-powered machinery that frequently failed under extreme loads. Cranes and pulleys were operated by teams of workers using ropes and wooden machinery that could break without warning, sending multi-ton stones crashing down on work crews. Construction sites were incredibly dangerous places where workers faced constant threats from falling objects and machinery failures. Stone cutting and carving exposed workers to constant dust that caused severe respiratory problems. Stone carvers worked with hammers and chisels for hours at a time, creating clouds of stone dust that accumulated in their lungs over years of exposure. The repetitive hammering motion also caused severe joint problems and hearing loss from the constant impact noise. Mortar mixing and application exposed construction workers to lime and other caustic substances that caused severe chemical burns. Roman mortar was extremely strong, but required workers to handle materials that could burn skin and eyes on contact. Construction workers often developed characteristic scarring on their hands and arms from repeated exposure to mortar ingredients. Demolition work was even more dangerous than new construction, as workers had to dismantle existing structures without modern safety equipment or techniques for controlling collapse. Demolition workers were often crushed under falling debris or injured by structural collapses that occurred without warning. The salvage of materials from demolished buildings required workers to enter partially collapsed structures that could collapse completely at any moment. Underground construction, including sewers, foundations, and storage chambers, exposed workers to cave-in risks and toxic gases. Workers dug by hand in unstable soil conditions, often working in spaces that were barely large enough for human bodies. Cave-ins were common and usually fatal, as rescue techniques were primitive and often ineffective. Roman religious practices created several horrible occupations that combined religious duty with extreme physical danger. While most religious work was relatively safe, certain specialized roles required workers to perform incredibly hazardous tasks in service to the gods. Sacred fire tenders in temples had to maintain fires that burned continuously, sometimes for centuries. These workers were responsible for keeping flames alive, regardless of weather conditions or other circumstances. And failure to maintain sacred fires was considered a serious religious offense that could result in severe punishment. Fire tenders worked with open flames, using primitive fire safety techniques, and burn injuries were common occupational hazards. The maintenance of sacred fires also required workers to handle large quantities of combustible materials, including oil, wood, and incense. Storage and transportation of these materials created additional fire hazards, and temple fires were common events that often killed the workers responsible for maintaining them. Animal sacrifice, while primarily performed by priests, required support workers who prepared and handled sacrificial animals. These workers had to restrain large animals during ritual slaughter, a task that frequently resulted in injuries from kicks, horns, and bites. The slaughter process itself was dangerous, as workers had to use sharp knives on struggling animals in ceremonial settings where precision was required. The disposal of sacrificial remains created additional horrible jobs within religious settings. Workers had to clean up after sacrifices, handling large quantities of blood and animal parts that attracted scavengers and spread diseases. Sacrifice sites became breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites that affected the health of cleanup workers. Temple construction often involved specialized religious requirements that made already dangerous construction work even more hazardous. Religious buildings frequently required workers to incorporate specific materials or construction techniques that were more dangerous than standard building practices. Sacred groves and religious sites were often located in remote or dangerous locations that increased risks for construction workers. Roman entertainment beyond gladiatorial games created other horrible occupations that combined performance with extreme danger.
Public entertainment was an essential part of Roman culture, but many forms of entertainment required workers to risk their lives for the amusement of spectators.
Chariot racing support workers faced dangers that were different from, but equally serious as those faced by the drivers themselves.
Stable workers handled racing horses that were bred for speed and aggression, making them dangerous to work with even when not racing.
These animals could kick, bite, or trample workers who had to feed, groom, and train them daily. Track maintenance workers had to prepare and maintain the racing surfaces where chariots traveled at high speeds. This work required workers to enter the track area to smooth sand and repair damage, sometimes while races were still in progress. Workers were regularly injured or killed by racing chariots that couldn't avoid them during high-speed competitions. Chariot construction and repair required workers to build vehicles that were designed for maximum speed rather than safety. Chariot builders worked with tools and techniques that were inadequate for creating reliable vehicles, and chariot failures during races often killed both drivers and spectators. The pressure to build faster chariots led to construction shortcuts that made the vehicles even more dangerous. Theatrical productions required stage workers to create elaborate special effects using fire, mechanical devices, and live animals. Stage workers operated primitive machinery that could malfunction and injure performers and audience members. The use of fire for dramatic effect was particularly dangerous, as theater buildings were constructed primarily of wood and could become infernos within minutes. Live animal performances required handlers to work with wild animals in front of large audiences, where escape was limited if animals became aggressive. Unlike gladiatorial beast hunts, theatrical animal acts required animals to perform specific behaviors, making them unpredictable and dangerous to their handlers. Training wild animals for performance was a process that frequently resulted in serious injuries or death for trainers. Musical instrument construction created occupational hazards that were subtle but serious. Wind instrument makers worked with materials including lead, mercury, and toxic woods that caused gradual poisoning over the course of their careers. Brass instrument construction required workers to handle molten metals and toxic polishing compounds that damaged their health through prolonged exposure. String instrument makers worked with animal parts, including sinew and bone, that could carry diseases from the source animals. The preparation of strings from animal intestines exposed workers to bacteria and parasites that caused chronic illnesses. Instrument builders often developed respiratory problems from inhaling dust from exotic woods and bone materials used in their craft. Roman medical practice, while more advanced than in many ancient civilizations, created horrible occupations for support workers who assisted physicians and surgeons. Medical knowledge was limited, and many medical procedures were extremely dangerous for both patients and medical workers. Surgical assistants worked without any understanding of disease transmission, regularly handling infected wounds and diseased tissue with their bare hands. These workers were constantly exposed to blood-borne diseases and infections that spread rapidly among medical workers. Surgical mortality rates were extremely high, and medical assistants often contracted diseases from the patients they attempted to help.
Medical instrument preparation required workers to clean and sharpen tools that had been used in surgery and wound treatment. These instruments were contaminated with blood and tissue from diseased patients, and workers who cleaned them without protection often contracted serious infections. Medical instruments were also primitive and frequently broke during procedures, injuring both patients and medical workers.
Pharmacy workers handled raw materials for medications that included raw plants, animal parts, and mineral compounds. Many Roman medicines were actually poisonous, and pharmacy workers who prepared them absorbed toxic substances through their skin and lungs. Lead-based medicines were particularly common and caused chronic lead poisoning among pharmacy workers. Dissection assistants helped physicians perform anatomical studies on human corpses, work that exposed them to diseases and decomposition products. Dissection was typically performed on unclaimed bodies that had often been dead for several days, creating health hazards from bacterial contamination and toxic gases produced by decomposition.
Hospital maintenance workers cleaned facilities that housed patients with infectious diseases, often without any understanding of how diseases spread.
These workers were constantly exposed to contaminated materials and frequently contracted diseases from patient waste and contaminated surfaces. Hospital mortality rates were high, and maintenance workers often died from diseases they contracted in the course of their work. Roman military medicine created additional horrible occupations that combined medical dangers with battlefield conditions. Field medics had to treat wounded soldiers under combat conditions, often working without adequate supplies or protection.
These workers were prime targets for enemy forces and faced constant danger from both enemy action and medical hazards.
Wound cleaning and bandaging exposed medical workers to infected injuries that often led to systemic infections in the medical workers themselves. Battlefield conditions made sterile technique impossible, and medical workers often developed severe infections from treating wounded soldiers. Many field medics died from diseases they contracted while treating others. Amputation assistants helped surgeons remove injured limbs using primitive tools and techniques.
These procedures were performed without anesthesia, requiring assistance to physically restrain patients during extremely painful operations. The psychological trauma of participating in these procedures often affected medical workers as severely as the physical dangers they faced. As we reach the final portion of our journey through these horrible Roman occupations, it becomes clear that the magnificent civilization we admire today was built on foundations of human suffering that are almost impossible for modern people to comprehend. Every marble column, every mile of Roman road, every aqueduct and amphitheater represented not just architectural achievement, but also the lives of countless workers who died to create these monuments. The cumulative effect of these horrible occupations on Roman society was profound and lasting. Entire generations of workers lived abbreviated lives marked by pain, disease, and premature death. The average life expectancy for workers in the most dangerous occupations was often less than 30 years, and many died even younger.
This constant turnover of workers created a society that was always in need of fresh bodies to feed into its industrial machinery. The psychological impact on Roman society was equally significant. A civilization that routinely condemned people to horrible working conditions developed a callousness toward human suffering that pervaded all levels of society. The acceptance of workplace deaths as normal and inevitable created a culture where individual human life had little intrinsic value, particularly for slaves and the poor. Roman literature and historical records rarely mention these workers or their suffering, focusing instead on the achievements of emperors, senators, and military leaders. This deliberate overlooking of worker conditions suggests that even contemporary Romans understood that their civilization's glory came at a terrible human cost, but chose to ignore this reality rather than address it. The economic structure of the Roman Empire made these horrible jobs inevitable. The vast wealth that supported Roman luxury and military power required cheap labor to extract resources, manufacture goods, and maintain infrastructure. Any improvement in working conditions would have increased costs and reduced profits, threatening the economic foundation of Roman civilization. Slavery made many of these horrible working conditions possible, as slaves had no choice in their occupations and no ability to demand better treatment. However, even free Romans often worked in equally dangerous conditions due to poverty and lack of alternatives. The empire's economic system created a class of disposable workers whose lives were considered less valuable than the products they created. The technological limitations of the ancient world contributed to the horrible nature of these occupations, but technology alone doesn't explain the extent of worker suffering. The Romans had the engineering knowledge to create safer working conditions in many industries, but chose not to invest in worker safety because human life was cheaper than safety equipment. Occupational medicine was virtually non-existent in the Roman world, as physicians focused on treating wealthy patients rather than understanding workplace diseases. Workers who developed occupational illnesses were usually abandoned by their employers and left to die without medical care. The concept of occupational safety was completely foreign to Roman thinking. The religious and philosophical beliefs of Roman society provided little support for workers suffering in dangerous occupations. While some philosophical schools taught about human dignity and worth, these ideas were rarely applied to slaves and laborers. Roman religion focused on maintaining favor with the gods rather than protecting workers from earthly dangers. Legal protections for workers were minimal and rarely enforced. While Roman law was sophisticated in many areas, it provided little recourse for workers injured or killed in dangerous occupations. Slaves had no legal standing to seek compensation for injuries, and even free workers had limited legal options when employers failed to provide safe working conditions. The social stigma attached to manual labor in Roman society made it difficult for workers to organize or demand better treatment. Physical work was considered degrading for free citizens, and those who performed it were viewed as inherently inferior. This social attitude made it easier for employers to justify horrible working conditions and low wages. Training and apprenticeship systems in dangerous occupations were designed to produce workers quickly rather than safely. New workers were often thrust into dangerous situations without adequate preparation, leading to high casualty rates among beginners. The pressure to begin productive work immediately meant that safety training was virtually non-existent. The geographic spread of the Roman Empire meant that horrible working conditions existed across 3 continents and dozens of different cultures. Local variations in climate, resources, and customs created different forms of worker suffering, but the fundamental disregard for worker safety was consistent throughout the empire. Transportation and communication limitations made it difficult for workers to escape horrible occupations by relocating to areas with better opportunities. Most workers were born into their occupations and died in the same locations where they began working. The lack of social mobility meant that horrible jobs were often hereditary, passed down from parents to children across multiple generations. The seasonal nature of many horrible occupations created periods of extreme danger, alternating with periods of unemployment. Agricultural workers, construction workers, and others faced peak danger during certain seasons, but had no income during other periods. This created a cycle of poverty that trapped workers in dangerous occupations. Urban concentration in Roman cities created unique forms of workplace danger, as industries were crowded together without regard for safety or environmental impact. Tanneries, foundries, and other dangerous industries operated in close proximity to residential areas, spreading their hazards to entire neighborhoods. The lack of zoning or environmental regulations meant that workplace dangers affected entire communities. Water and air pollution from industrial activities created health hazards that extended far beyond the workers directly involved in production. Lead contamination from plumbing and mining, smoke from foundries and furnaces, and waste from various industries created environmental conditions that shortened lives throughout Roman society. The military nature of Roman expansion meant that many civilian occupations were organized along military lines, with strict hierarchy and harsh discipline. Workers in dangerous occupations were often treated like soldiers, expected to follow orders without question and accept casualties as inevitable. This militaristic approach to civilian work increased the dangers faced by ordinary workers. The competitive nature of Roman society created pressure to increase production regardless of worker safety. Entrepreneurs and estate owners who showed concern for worker welfare were at a disadvantage compared to those willing to accept higher casualty rates in pursuit of profits. This economic pressure made horrible working conditions a competitive necessity rather than a choice. The educational system in Roman society did not prepare people to recognize or address occupational hazards. Most workers were illiterate and had no understanding of the long-term health effects of their work. Even educated Romans had little scientific knowledge about the causes of occupational diseases or workplace accidents. Medical knowledge of the time was insufficient to understand many occupational health hazards, particularly those involving toxic exposure or repetitive motion injuries. Diseases that developed gradually over years were rarely connected to workplace conditions, so workers continued to be exposed to hazards that medical science could have identified with better understanding.
The entertainment value placed on dangerous occupations, particularly in gladiatorial games and public spectacles, created a culture that celebrated rather than deplored workplace danger. Romans found excitement in watching others risk their lives, creating social pressure to maintain dangerous occupations for entertainment purposes. International trade in the Roman Empire created demand for products that required horrible working conditions to produce. Luxury goods from distant provinces often involved mining, manufacturing, or transportation under the most dangerous possible conditions. Roman consumers were generally unaware of the human cost of the goods they purchased. The archaeological record reveals the extent of worker suffering through skeletal remains that show evidence of occupational injuries and diseases. Cemeteries near mining sites, industrial areas, and construction projects contain disproportionate numbers of skeletons showing signs of workplace trauma, providing physical evidence of the horrible conditions described in literary sources. Climate change during the Roman period, particularly cooling temperatures in later centuries, made many outdoor occupations even more dangerous than they had been during earlier periods. Agricultural workers, construction workers, and others faced additional hazards from harsh weather conditions that Roman technology was inadequate to address. The decline of Roman political stability in later centuries created additional dangers for workers, as civil wars, barbarian invasions, and economic disruption made already dangerous occupations even more hazardous. Workers were often caught between competing armies or forced to work under even worse conditions as economic pressures increased. Regional variations in worker treatment existed throughout the empire, with some provinces developing slightly better conditions than others. However, even in areas with relatively better treatment, working conditions remained horrible by modern standards. The variations were differences in degree rather than fundamental differences in approach to worker safety. The legacy of Roman occupational practices influenced later European developments, as many of the same industries and techniques continued to be used for centuries after the fall of Rome. Medieval and early modern workers often faced conditions that were direct descendants of Roman workplace practices, perpetuating cycles of occupational suffering across generations. Archaeological excavations at Roman industrial sites reveal the physical remnants of these horrible working conditions. Furnaces, mines, and workshops show evidence of repeated accidents, unsafe construction, and environmental contamination that affected workers throughout their operational periods. These physical remains provide concrete evidence of the working conditions described in historical sources. The demographic impact of horrible occupations on Roman society was significant, as high mortality rates among workers required constant recruitment of new workers to replace those who died. This created a continuous demand for slaves and drove military expansion to capture new sources of labor for dangerous occupations. Cultural attitudes toward work and workers that developed during the Roman period influenced Western civilization for centuries afterward. The Roman view that manual labor was inherently degrading and that worker safety was unimportant became embedded in European culture and continued to influence labor practices long after the fall of the Roman Empire. The economic efficiency of using expendable workers in horrible occupations provided short-term benefits for Roman society, but created long-term costs in terms of human capital and social development. The decision to prioritize immediate profits over worker welfare ultimately contributed to the economic problems that plagued the later Roman Empire. Religious and philosophical responses to worker suffering varied throughout Roman society, with some groups developing beliefs about the dignity of labor, while others maintained that suffering was natural and inevitable. However, none of these philosophical movements succeeded in creating significant improvements in working conditions during the Roman period. The technological innovations that the Romans are famous for were often applied to increasing production rather than improving worker safety. Roman engineering achievements in construction, military equipment, and infrastructure rarely included innovations designed to protect workers from occupational hazards. Legal developments during the Roman period created sophisticated systems for protecting property rights and commercial interests, but failed to develop similar protections for workers. This legal framework prioritized economic efficiency over human welfare, creating institutional support for horrible working conditions. International comparisons reveal that horrible working conditions were not unique to Roman civilization. But Roman society was unusual in the scale and systematic nature of its exploitation of workers. The Roman Empire's size and organizational sophistication allowed it to create horrible occupations on a scale that had never been seen before in human history. The literary record suggests that some contemporary Romans were aware of and troubled by the horrible conditions faced by workers, but social and economic pressures prevented significant reforms. Writers occasionally mentioned worker suffering, but these observations rarely led to practical improvements in working conditions. Archaeological evidence from worker housing shows that people in dangerous occupations often lived in conditions that were nearly as horrible as their working environments. Poor nutrition, overcrowding, and unsanitary conditions at home compounded the health hazards faced at work, creating a comprehensive environment of suffering for workers and their families. The seasonal migration of workers for agriculture and construction created additional hazards, as people traveled long distances to work in temporary, often makeshift conditions. These migrant workers faced the combined dangers of travel, unfamiliar working conditions, and exploitation by employers who had no long-term relationship with their workforce. Training and skill development in dangerous occupations was minimal, as employers preferred to use workers as expendable labor rather than invest in their long-term development. This lack of training increased accident rates and prevented the development of safer working techniques that might have reduced casualty rates. The social networks that might have provided support for workers were often disrupted by the dangerous nature of their occupations. High mortality rates meant that families were frequently broken up, and communities centered around dangerous work sites were constantly losing members. This social disruption made it even more difficult for workers to organize for better conditions. Regional environmental factors contributed to the horrible nature of many occupations, as work in hot climates, high altitudes, or areas with extreme weather created additional hazards beyond those inherent in the work itself. Roman expansion into diverse geographic regions exposed workers to environmental dangers they were not equipped to handle.
The military organization of many civilian work projects meant that workers were subject to military discipline and punishment, even when they were not soldiers. This militarization of civilian labor created additional sources of suffering and made it difficult for workers to resist dangerous conditions. Economic cycles within the Roman Empire created periods when demand for dangerous work increased dramatically, leading to even worse conditions as employers pushed for maximum production. During military campaigns, construction booms, or resource extraction phases, worker casualty rates increased significantly. The cultural celebration of Roman achievements often overshadowed contemporary awareness of the human cost of these accomplishments. Public monuments and celebrations focused on the end results rather than the process of creation, making it easier for Roman society to ignore worker suffering. Medical treatment for occupational injuries was primitive and often made conditions worse rather than better. Workers who survived initial injuries often died from infections or complications that modern medicine could easily treat. The lack of effective medical care meant that even minor workplace accidents often became fatal. The transportation of materials and products created additional horrible occupations as workers had to move heavy, dangerous, or toxic items across long distances using primitive equipment. Transportation accidents were common and often involved multiple casualties when carts overturned or loads shifted unexpectedly. Quality control in Roman manufacturing was often achieved through harsh punishment of workers rather than through improved processes or equipment. Workers who made mistakes faced physical punishment or execution, creating an atmosphere of terror that made already dangerous work even more stressful. The concentration of wealth in Roman society meant that a small elite benefited enormously from the horrible working conditions endured by the majority. This extreme inequality created social tensions that contributed to the political instability that eventually destroyed the Roman Empire. International trade networks spread Roman labor practices to other parts of the ancient world, as Roman merchants and administrators introduced Roman working methods to provinces and trading partners. This cultural export extended the influence of Roman attitudes toward worker safety far beyond the empire's direct political control. The archaeological record shows evidence of workplace accidents and occupational diseases in skeletal remains from all levels of Roman society, indicating that horrible working conditions affected even skilled craftsmen and supervisors. The dangers of Roman occupations were so pervasive that they touched every social class except the very wealthy. Seasonal variations in working conditions created periods of extreme danger, alternating with periods of relative safety, but workers had little choice but to continue working during the most dangerous seasons. Agricultural workers, for example, faced peak dangers during harvest seasons, but had no alternatives for earning income. The administrative complexity of the Roman Empire created bureaucratic occupations that, while not physically dangerous, exposed workers to different forms of suffering, including corruption, arbitrary punishment, and psychological stress. Even white-collar occupations in Roman society often involved significant personal risks. Urban planning in Roman cities rarely considered the safety of workers, as industrial and residential areas were mixed together without regard for the environmental and safety impacts of dangerous occupations. This urban design created neighborhoods where entire populations were exposed to industrial hazards. The competitive pressure between different regions of the Roman Empire created incentives to reduce costs by making working conditions worse rather than better. Provinces that maintained higher safety standards were at an economic disadvantage compared to those willing to accept higher worker casualty rates.
Cultural attitudes toward pain and suffering in Roman society made it difficult for workers to gain sympathy for their conditions, as physical hardship was often viewed as character building rather than as a social problem requiring solutions.
This cultural acceptance of suffering made reform efforts more difficult. The legal system's focus on property rights rather than personal rights meant that workers injured in the course of their employment had little recourse against employers. Even free citizens had difficulty obtaining compensation for workplace injuries, while slaves had no legal standing whatsoever. Religious practices sometimes made working conditions worse rather than better, as certain occupations were required to meet ritual requirements that increased their danger. Sacred construction projects, for example, often had to be completed according to religious specifications that made the work more hazardous. The demographic composition of workers in horrible occupations was heavily skewed toward young men, as these jobs required physical strength but killed workers before they could reach middle age. This demographic pattern created social problems as communities lost their young adult males to dangerous occupations. International conflicts and military campaigns created sudden spikes in demand for workers in dangerous occupations, as the empire needed increased production of weapons, fortifications, and supplies. These military emergencies often led to even worse working conditions, as production quotas took priority over any consideration of worker safety. The environmental legacy of Roman industrial practices continued to affect people long after specific work sites were abandoned. Contaminated soil and water from mining and manufacturing operations created health hazards that persisted for generations after the original workers were dead. Economic theories of the time provided intellectual justification for horrible working conditions, as Roman thinkers generally believed that economic efficiency required the use of the cheapest possible labor. This theoretical framework made it difficult for reform-minded individuals to argue for better working conditions. The social mobility that was theoretically possible in Roman society was largely blocked for people working in horrible occupations, as these jobs destroyed health and social standing in ways that made advancement extremely difficult. Workers in dangerous occupations were effectively trapped in a permanent underclass. Cultural exchange within the Roman Empire sometimes led to the spread of particularly dangerous working techniques from one region to another, as administrators and entrepreneurs adopted methods that had proven profitable elsewhere without considering their human costs. The archaeological evidence suggests that working conditions in Roman times were often worse than in earlier civilizations, as the Roman emphasis on large-scale production and military efficiency led to more systematic exploitation of workers than had existed in smaller, less organized societies. Regional rebellions and social unrest were often triggered by horrible working conditions, as workers reached the limits of what they could endure and turned to violence as their only means of protest. These rebellions were usually suppressed brutally, making conditions even worse for surviving workers.
The psychological trauma experienced by workers in horrible occupations was rarely recognized or treated, as Roman society had no understanding of mental health issues. Workers who survived physical dangers often suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but received no support for these psychological injuries. The family structures of workers in dangerous occupations were often disrupted by high mortality rates and frequent relocations, creating social problems that extended beyond the workplace itself. Children of workers in horrible occupations often faced malnutrition, abandonment, and premature entry into dangerous work themselves. International trade relationships were sometimes based on the availability of workers willing to endure horrible conditions, as certain products could only be produced economically in locations where human life was considered expendable. This trade dynamic created international pressure to maintain dangerous working conditions. The technological knowledge existed to improve many working conditions, but economic incentives favored maintaining dangerous practices rather than investing in safety improvements. Roman engineers were capable of creating safer mining techniques, for example, but chose not to implement them because worker deaths were cheaper than equipment upgrades. As we conclude this extensive journey through the horrible occupations of ancient Rome, we must recognize that these weren't aberrations or accidents, but integral parts of a civilization that chose economic efficiency over human welfare. The marble monuments and military conquests that we associate with Roman greatness were purchased with the lives of countless workers whose names we'll never know and whose suffering we can barely imagine. The Roman Empire lasted for over 1,000 years in various forms, but its foundation was built on a simple and terrible equation. Human life was cheaper than safety equipment, worker training, or improved conditions. This calculation wasn't hidden or secret. It was the open basis of Roman economic policy, accepted by everyone from emperors to philosophers as the natural order of things. Perhaps most sobering is the realization that these horrible occupations weren't exceptional events, but daily realities for millions of people across multiple generations. Every sunrise brought another day of danger for workers in mines, foundries, construction sites, and countless other locations throughout the empire. Every sunset marked another day survived by those lucky enough to make it through their shifts alive. The workers who endured these conditions didn't do so willingly or heroically. They did so because they had no choice. Slavery, poverty, and social conditions that offered no alternatives trapped people in occupations that slowly or quickly destroyed their bodies and minds. Their suffering wasn't meaningful or purposeful. It was simply the price that Roman civilization chose to exact for its achievements. Modern labor conditions, while far from perfect, exist in a world where the basic principle that human life has value is at least nominally accepted. We have workplace safety regulations, workers' compensation, labor unions, and legal systems that recognize worker rights, all developments that would have been incomprehensible to ancient Romans. The distance between Roman working conditions and our own represents centuries of social progress that we often take for granted. Yet the legacy of Roman attitudes toward work and workers continued to influence European civilization for many centuries after the fall of Rome.
The idea that manual labor was inherently degrading, that worker safety was optional, and that economic efficiency justified human suffering persisted well into the modern era.
In some ways, we're still working to overcome the social attitudes that made Roman workplace horrors possible.
The archaeological and historical evidence for these horrible occupations serves as a reminder that great civilizations are not necessarily good civilizations, and that impressive achievements often come at costs that aren't visible to later generations.
The Roman Empire's legacy includes magnificent architecture, legal innovations, and cultural achievements, but it also includes the systematic exploitation and destruction of human lives on an enormous scale.
Tonight, as you lay in your comfortable bed, perhaps think for a moment about the millions of people who lived and died in conditions that we can barely imagine, whose pain and suffering built the foundation for much of what we now consider Western civilization. Their names are lost to history, but their sacrifice made possible the world we inhabit today. In remembering their struggles, we honor their memory and commit ourselves to ensuring that such conditions never again become acceptable in human society. Good night.